You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching the Intrepid radio program and listening to it in audio on either Odyssey Radio, that's ODYSY1.com, or over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And the beautiful thing about the chat room, or the beautiful thing is the chat room over on the YouTube channel. You can join it live now. And right away I start with coughing. Sorry, my voice is a little sketchy today. I've been a little scratchy the last few days. It's been very hot and humid here. It raises my my allergies, and at the same time, the air conditioning's cranked. So you go from the hot to the cold to the hot to the cold. So pardon me for that. I'll take as many sips of coffee as I can, and we'll see if I can survive this show tonight. Well, welcome to your Friday. I hope you had a good day, and welcome to Friday here on the Intrepid radio program. We're going to continue on our series on Native Americans and the conquering of the Native American West by the United States. And these are difficult topics to look at because there is a decided justification by the United States at the time for doing what they did. But what they had to do was declare the Native American less than superior, less than human, in order to treat them the way they did. And so our policy, official policy, was to drive them off their land, to claim their land, to take it from them. We're conquering them, and we supposedly were doing it without warring with them, and we were only responding to their hostilities. That's the way the picture was painted for us, and that's what we learned. That's why we even grew up. I know I grew up in the prime of America. You know, I was a post-World War II baby, technically, even though I wasn't born until 1960. And that whole baby boomer era from the end of World War II, 15 years before I was born, and up until the time I was born was considered that, you know, that was the time of white picket fences and the American dream and peace in America and all of this. And during this time we had our prime time television shows, an early age of television and movies, and all these things depicted the cowboys and Indians. The Indians were always the bad guy, and it was with rare exception that you found movies in that era that painted the Native American in any good light. And that's because we were coming out of that era. This was only 100 years. I was born less than 100 years after the events we've been talking about over the last week. And so in that century, prior to when I was born in 1960, in the 1860s, you had all this pushing of Native Americans onto reservations. Now, it had started 100 years before that, but the policy the United States had in place was one of manifest destiny. We have been manifest by God and are destined to take this whole continent and make it a nation, which we did. And that nation is a good nation overall, even though our past and our origins can be checkered with failures, and checkered with atrocity, and checkered with the badness of human nature. And I like to say, you know, humans are generally good. You lump them together into a government and they can get generally very bad in nature. So and that's a blanket statement, of course. So we've talked about this already, what has led up to this. This is the subjugation of the Native American people. Because we were able to subjugate them, we conquered them. Because we were stronger than them, we had the ability to push them off their land. And, of course, we tried to make it look so fair to the world and to history by writing the treaties that we wrote. And at the same time, those treaties were about as worthless as the paper they were written on, because they were constantly rescinded, constantly changed, as soon as eminent domain set in, and the United States learned that some of the reservations they pushed these Indians onto had valuable minerals underneath them that they wanted. And so they would rescind the treaties. And so the story kept going and going and going. And sometimes you don't even realize you're driving through reservation territory today. You can go in Minnesota, you could be driving, and you'll see a little sign that says, you're on the, the such and such reservation in this forest. And so the reservation land is there. You can look on a map. I challenge you, take a map of your state that shows the Native American reservations, and you might see them spotted all over the place. They were once all one, and they got all subdivided as the United States came in and rescinded treaties. So what we've been looking at the last couple of nights is Little Crow's War. And Little Crow's War is the one that's closest to my territory and one I'm most familiar with, because it happened right here in my state. And it happened right in places where I have lived, places that are today residential areas of southern Minneapolis and the far southern suburbs, and going into the smaller towns, going south of Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's where all these things took place. And last night, we left off talking about the fallout of the Dakota War, Little Crow's War, the Dakota Uprising, if you will. And remember that the generals, it was Ramsey and it was Sibley, and General Pope sent this, they were looking for, how do you want to say this? Not a scapegoat. They were looking to not be blamed, any one of them, for wanting to put to execute 303 Sioux warriors. And so they had these men all captive, and they tried them, and acted because they said they were not part of the United States, did not give them, they had no right to a defense by Constitution. So they just tried them and condemned them to execution. And nobody wanted to take that responsibility on their head. And so what do? They end up finally sending this to the President of the United States. Here's what happened, here's the war that went on, and the Civil War is going on right now, by the way, at the same time. And so they send this to Lincoln. And Lincoln pretty much says, you know what, I'm not going to... He refused to authorize immediate hanging of the 303 condemned Santee Sioux. And this angered General Pope and Governor Ramsey. And Pope protested that, quote, the criminals condemned ought, in every view, to be at once executed without exception. Humanity requires an immediate disposition of the case. That's what he's saying. So he's hailing back on Lincoln's humanity. To be humane, we've got to kill these guys right now, not let them linger in prison. And Ramsey demanded authority from the president to order a speedy execution of all 303 of these men. And he warned that the people of Minnesota would take private revenge on the prisoners if Lincoln didn't act quickly. And that's what he asked of Lincoln. That's what he told the president. And while President Lincoln was reviewing the trial records, he had two lawyers working on this in D.C. Sibley, remember, Long Trader Sibley, the general, he moved the condemned Indians to a prison camp at South Bend on the Minnesota River. And while they were being escorted past New Ulm, A mob of citizens that included many women attempted to private revenge, and they would beat these crowds, even killed a child. They clubbed him to death. And Sibley decided to keep the remaining 1,700 Santee, mostly women and children, as prisoners, although they were accused of no crime other than having been born Indian. And he ordered them transferred overland to Fort Snelling. And along the way, they too were assaulted by angry mobs and angry white citizens, and many were stoned and clubbed. This is what you get when you have mob mentality. A child was snatched from its mother's arms and beaten to death. They beat a baby to death. At Fort Snelling, the 4-mile-long procession was shunted into a fenced enclosure on damp bottomland, and there, under soldier guard, housed in dilapidated shelters and fed on scanty rations, the remnants of the once proud woodland Sioux awaited their fate. And if you're watching on the YouTube stream, I am going to show you a couple of pictures. And many of you have seen these before, and I have not imported them yet, so I'll import them while we're talking. This is a photograph of the camp that was taken in 1862, and this is what it looked like. I've got it saved here. I've just got to call it up for those of you listening on radio, audio only. Sorry you can't see this. You can always come over and check out the archive, or come over right now if you're sitting near a computer, and you'll be able to see this. Now, this is the concentration camp right here. All right, this was taken from the fort up on the bluffs overlooking the flatlands down below the river. Now, you can see this. It said that they put them in shanties and old outbuildings and stuff. Well, then they erected the walls, and they also put up these teepees. These are the old shelters that they had. And so this is, you see the river behind them running along the picture. That's the south bend of the river, the Minnesota coming off of the Mississippi. And if you look way past Pike's Island, which is right above that river, you see way in the background, you see a thin sliver of river back there. That's the Mississippi that's going through on the other side of, this is Pike's Island in the middle, or Pike Island in the middle. And so where this concentration camp sits is below the fort. And this is where Rocky and I had gone last autumn. And we went with Rainey and with Sarah Soderlin. And we were right on this spot. This is all wooded now. And you can see some of the smaller trees in the background. This was all cleared off when they built this. And it was all built out of lumber, I'm sure, that was taken from the trees here. But this is the camp itself. And this is where 1,700 people were crammed into here. And where 300 of them died of starvation, deprivation, the weather down there on the river flats during the winter of 1862. So that right there is the concentration camp. And I have one more picture I'm going to show you of this was at the fort. And this is a painting that was done. I think this is a more contemporary painting. But here it is. This is a painting from within that concentration camp down below. You can see the fort up on the bluff above in the background. You can see a steamship that's on the river behind them. That would be the Mississippi back there. And the Minnesota would cut off on the right here and go south. You're looking basically north here in this painting. And this is what the conditions looked like as imagined by an artist of the fort and the concentration camp below. So that's where all these people were being held. And Lincoln, in the meantime, didn't issue his, took him a couple of months, issue his decision on the 303 executions of Native American warriors, Santee warriors. And then on December 6th, President Lincoln notified Sibley, back in St. Paul, that he should cause to be executed 39 of the 303 convicted Santee. Now, nobody knows, and Lincoln didn't state, and it's always been a slight bit of a mystery as to how he arrived at the 39. But he said, the other condemned prisoners you'll hold subject to further orders, taking care that they neither escape nor are subjected to any unlawful violence. And so he says, their safety is on you. But 39 of these men will be executed. An execution date was the 26th day of September, the day after Christmas, in the moon when the deer shed their horns. That morning, the town of Mankato was filled with vindictive and morbidly curious citizens, and a regiment of soldiers marched in to keep order. At the last minute, one Indian was given a reprieve, and that left 38 to be executed. And I'm going to throw up one more picture for you. This is the, we had this up yesterday, right here. This is the scene in Mankato. And I know there were some photographs taken as well, but this is what I found. This is a painting of that scene. And make sure I've got that lined up. So there you have the 38 men on the scaffold. And so the one man was given a reprieve, and at about 10 o'clock, the 38 condemned men were marched from the prison to the scaffold. They sang the Sioux death song until soldiers pulled white caps over their heads and placed nooses around their necks. At a signal from an army officer, the control rope was cut, and 38 Santee Sioux dangled lifeless in the air. But for the intercession of Abraham Lincoln, there would have been 300 men executed that morning. Even so, a spectator boasted that it was America's greatest mass execution. A few hours later, officials discovered that 2 of the men hanged were not on Lincoln's list. But nothing was said of this publicly until 9 years later. It was a matter of great regret that any mistakes were made, declared one of those responsible. I feel sure they were not made intentionally. Now, one of the innocent men hanged had saved a white woman's life during the raiding. Several others who were executed that day maintained their innocence until the end. One of them was Inyanka, who had tried to stop the war from even starting, but later joined with Little Crow. When Little Crow and his followers left for Dakota, Wabasha had persuaded Inyanka not to go. And so shortly before his execution, Inyanka dictated a farewell letter to his chief. And it said this: Wabasha, you have deceived me. You told me that if we followed the advice of General Sibley and gave ourselves up to the whites, all would be well. No innocent man would be injured. I have not killed, I have not wounded, I have not injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property, and yet today I am set apart for execution and must die in a few days, while men who are guilty will remain in prison. My wife is your daughter. My children are your grandchildren. I leave them all in your care and under your protection. Do not let them suffer. And when my children are grown up, let them know that their father died because he followed the advice of his chief, and without having the blood of a white man to answer for to the Great Spirit. My wife and children are dear to me. Let them not grieve me. Let them remember that the brave should be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. Your son-in-law, Rada'inyanka. Now those who escaped the execution were sentenced to prison. One of them was Big Eagle. And we'll tell you a little bit about his experience here. But that's what happened with the execution. 38 men, as a result of Little Crow's war, were executed. So, Big Eagle was imprisoned. He readily admitted participating in the battles. If I had known that I would be sent to the penitentiary, he said, I would not have surrendered. But when I had been in the penitentiary 3 years and they were about to turn me out, I told them they might keep me another year if they wished, and I meant what I said. I did not like the way I had been treated. I surrendered in good faith, knowing that many of the whites were acquainted with me and that I had not been a murderer, or present when murder had been committed, and if I had killed or wounded a man, it had been in a fair, open fight. Many of the others regretted that they had not fled from Minnesota with the warriors. Now, as you know, many of the whites, the settlers, saw these men as these Santee Sioux as all being marauding marauding murderers. And that was the paradigm they were in. They believed they had a right to, they were told they had a right to this land. This land is ours now. They had driven the Native American out. They had driven the Indian away, put him on reservations, got him out of the way, and they just simply went along with it. This is the way things were done. And this was now their land, and so they saw the Indians attacking them as murderous, while the Indians themselves saw it as, well, there were some bad men that plundered and murdered and raped. Overall, this was their reaction to the white United States who had driven them off of their land, out of their homeland, and so they were attacking them. So by the time of the executions in Mankato, Little Crow and his followers were camped on Devil's Lake, a wintering place for several Sioux tribes, and during the winter he tried to unite the chiefs in a military alliance, warning them unless they were prepared to fight, they would all go down before the invading whites. He won their sympathy, but a few of the Plains Indians believed that they were in any danger at all. If the white men moved into the Dakota country, the Indians would simply move farther west. The land was big enough for everybody, they said. And in the spring, Little Crow, Shakopee, and Medicine Bottle took their bands north into Canada. At Fort Garry in Winnipeg, which from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, if you drive to Winnipeg now, you're looking at about 6 hours up to the Canadian border by car, and maybe another 2 hours up to Winnipeg from there, Ontario. It's almost straight north from Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And so that gives you an idea of the distance they traveled. And for his first meeting with the British authorities, he dressed in his best clothing, a black coat with a velvet collar, a blue cloth breechclout, deerskin leggings. He reminded the British that his grandfather had been their ally in previous wars with the Americans, and that in the War of 1812 the Santee had captured a cannon from the Americans and presented it to the British. On that occasion, Little Crow said the British had promised the Santees that if they were ever in trouble and wanted help, the British would bring the cannon back to them with men to work it. And the Santee, they told them, were now in trouble and wanted the cannon brought back. An issue of foodstuffs, however, was all that Little Crow could obtain from the British Canadians. They had no cannon to give the Santee, not even ammunition for weapons that they had. So in the Strawberry Moon, June of 1863, Little Crow decided what he must do. If he and his family were forced to become Plains Indians, they must have horses. And the white men who had driven him from his land had horses, and he would take their horses in exchange for the land. And he decided to return to Minnesota with a small party to round up and capture horses. And we're at the end of the first segment, folks. Sit tight. We're going to be right back and go into the conclusion of Little Crow's War.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting on. Thanks for holding on through that break. Welcome back to the show on this Friday night. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You're also welcome to, if you're not already there, come over to my YouTube channel, watch the video simulcast, join the live chat room of Intrepheads. And that is over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, I want to take this moment to do something that I didn't do last night, and that is to wish a very happy birthday to Audrey. She is our Girl Friday with my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, and Rocky Stucci's in my show, the Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. She's been with us since the beginning. She does all our moderating in our chat rooms, and she's a dear friend. She's been up here, as a matter of fact. I need to mention, too, when Rocky and I visited Fort Snelling in the concentration camp of the Dakota, that area, which is, by the way, it's not even marked. It's in the woods, and you're guessing, approximating right where that would have been. Even though there's a monument that was put up by the Dakota, a log monument way down by the Visitors Center. But Audrey was with us, and she went through those woods with us, trudged through them, walked over onto Pike's Island with us, and she saw the whole site as well. But a very one day late happy birthday, although I did say happy birthday to you online yesterday. Everybody wish Audrey a very happy belated birthday, as it was yesterday. And so, misdenewsed yesterday, redeemed today, I hope. Happy birthday, Audrey. So now, The white men who had driven Little Crow from his land had horses. And so his intent now was to leave Winnipeg and British Canada and go back down south to his old tromping grounds and steal horses. His 16-year-old son, Wawanapa, later told about it. He said, "Father said he could not fight the white men, but he would go below and steal horses from them and give them to his children, so that they could be comfortable, and then he would go away off. Father also told me that he was getting old, and he wanted me to go with him to carry his bundles. He left his wives and other children behind. There were 16 men and one squaw in the party that went below with us. We had no horses, but walked all the way down to the settlements. In the moon of the red-blooming lilies, they reached the big woods, which only a few years before had been Santee country. But now it was filling up with farms and settlements. And on the afternoon of July 3rd of 1863, what is it today? Is it the 3rd today? Yeah, today is July 3rd. So this was 1863. So this would have been, what is that, 147 years ago today. So 140, if I did my math right in my head, 147 years ago today was when Little Crow and Wawanapa left their hidden camping place and went to pick raspberries near the settlement of Hutchinson, Minnesota. And so about sundown, they were sighted by 2 settlers returning home from a deer hunt. As the state of Minnesota had recently begun paying $25 bounty for Sioux scalps, the settlers immediately opened fire. Little Crow was hit in the side, just above the hip. His gun and mine were lying on the ground, Wawanapa said. He took up my gun and fired it first, and then fired his own gun. The ball struck the stock of his gun, and then hit him in the side, near the shoulder. This was the shot that killed him. He told me that he was killed and asked me for water, which I gave him. He died immediately after. When I heard the first shot fired, I lay down. The men did not see me before Father was killed. Wawanapa hurriedly dressed his dead father in new moccasins for the journey to the land of ghosts. He covered the body with a coat and fled to the camp. After warning the other members of the party to scatter, he started back to Devil's Lake. I traveled only at night, as I had no ammunition to kill anything to eat. I had not strength enough to travel fast. In an abandoned village near Big Stone Lake, he found a single cartridge and managed to shoot a wolf. I ate some of it, which gave me strength to travel, and I went on up the lake until the day I was captured. Wawanapa was captured by some of Long Trader Sibley's soldiers who had marched into the Dakota country that summer to kill Sioux. The soldiers returned the 16-year-old boy to Minnesota, where he was given a military trial and sentenced to be hanged. He learned then that his father's scalp and skull had been preserved and placed on exhibition in St. Paul. This was Little Crow's scalp and skull. The state of Minnesota presented the settlers who had killed Little Crow with the regular scalp bounty and a bonus of $500, which in 1847, somebody can look that up, go put that in the chat room, what that's worth in today's dollars. $500 in 1863. What was that worth in comparison to today's money? That's a lot of money. So when Wawanapa's trial record was sent to Washington, military authorities disapproved of the proceedings and commuted the boy's sentence to imprisonment. Some years later, after his release from prison, Wawanapa changed his name to Thomas Wakeman. He became a church deacon, and he founded the first Young Men's Christian Association among the Sioux. He was the founder of the YMCA amongst the Sioux. So meanwhile, Shakopee and Medicine Bottle remained in Canada, and they believed themselves beyond reach of the vengeful Minnesotans. And in December of 1863, one of Long Trader's little chiefs, Major Edwin Hatch, marched a battalion of Minnesota cavalry to Pembina, just below the Canadian frontier. And from there, Hatch sent a lieutenant across the line to Fort Garry to meet secretly with an American citizen, John Mackenzie. And with the aid of Mackenzie and 2 Canadians, the lieutenant arranged the capture of Shakopee and Medicine Bottle. So during a friendly meeting with the 2 Santee war chiefs, the conspirators gave them wine mixed with laudanum, chloroformed them while they slept, bound their hands and feet, and strapped them to a dog sled. In complete disregard of international law, the lieutenant hauled his captives across the border and delivered them to Major Hatch at Pembina. A few months later, Sibley staged another spectacular trial, and Shakopee and Medicine Bottle were sentenced to death. They were going to be hanged. Of the verdict, the St. Paul Pioneer Press commented, the St. Paul Pioneer. As a matter of fact, I worked for that newspaper in the late 90s as an art director. The St. Paul Pioneer Press is still in existence in downtown St. Paul today. So of the verdict, the St. Paul Pioneer commented, "We do not believe that serious injustice will be done by the executions tomorrow. But it would have been more creditable if some tangible evidence of their guilt had been obtained." You catch that? You catch how even the public and the newspapers were reporting this? "We do not believe that serious injustice will take place at the hangings tomorrow. But it would have been nice if they had some tangible evidence of their guilt." Meaning there was no tangible evidence they were guilty of anything. No white man tried before a jury of his peers would be executed upon the testimony thus produced. So in essence, they're saying, we think they're guilty and probably need to be hanged. But it would be nice if they'd have presented evidence, because there isn't a white man alive that could be tried and hung on the evidence, the kind of evidence that was presented at these 2 Indians' trial. And so after the hangings, the Minnesota legislature gratefully appropriated $1,000 as payment to John Mackenzie for his services in Canada. That's a lot of money too back then, $1,000. So the day of the Santee Sioux in Minnesota now officially came to an end. Although most of the war chiefs and the warriors were dead, in prison, or far beyond the borders of the state, the uprising had given the white citizens an opportunity to seize the Santee remaining lands without even a pretense of payment. Previous treaties were abrogated, and in other words, broken, and the surviving Indians were informed that they could be removed to a reservation in Dakota Territory, a little bit out west of here. You drive about 4.5 hours west of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, you end up in Fargo. That's almost straight line west from here, and you're in the Dakota Territory. And even those leaders who had collaborated with the whites had to go. Exterminate or banish was the cry of land-hungry settlers. They wanted the land of these Indians, and so they called out exterminate or banish. That was the attitude of the white settlers. And the first shipment of 770 Santee left St. Paul by steamboat on May 4th of 1863, and white Minnesotans lined the river landing to see them off with shouts of derision, showers of hurled stones. Crow Creek on the Missouri River was the site chosen for the Santee Reservation. The soil was barren, rainfall scanty, wild game scarce, and the alkaline water unfit for drinking. Soon the surrounding hills were covered with graves. Of the 1,300 Santee brought there in 1863, less than 1,000 survived their first winter. Among the viewers or the visitors to Crow Creek that year was a young Teton Sioux. He looked with pity upon his Santee cousins and listened to their stories of the Americans who had taken their land and driven them away. And truly, he thought, that nation of white men is like a spring freshet that overruns its banks and destroys all who are in its path. Soon they would take the buffalo country, unless the hearts of the Indians were strong enough to hold it. He resolved that he would fight to hold this land. His name was Tatanka Yotanka, the Sitting Bull. And that is what happened to Little Crow, the Santee Sioux, the Dakota Uprising of 1862 in Minnesota. And that's the fallout from it. And yet it was the young man's Sitting Bull, Tatanka Yotanka, of the Teton Sioux, who visited Crow Creek and learned from his brother Indians what had taken place and how all of this had come down and how all that land was now gone and how all of those Sioux from the woodland area were now part of the reservations in the plains. So that is the end of Little Crow and Little Crow's War. I wanted to say a little bit more because we have a few minutes left about the Fort Snelling concentration camp. This is kind of a cursory overview of the war, and the causes of the U.S.-Dakota War in 1862 are many, as we've read about, and we've seen, and we've talked about and discussed over the last few days. And it remains one of the most important events in Minnesota history. The effects of the war can still be felt today in Minnesota. And Fort Snelling played a central role in the war and its aftermath, and in early August of 1862, recruitment of the 6th through the 11th Infantry regiments meant for service in the Civil War had commenced. When news of the Dakota attacks reached St. Paul, Governor Ramsey appointed Henry Sibley, a colonel in the state's military forces and a commander of the army that would march against the Dakota. Sibley led 4 hastily armed companies of the 6th Infantry Regiment from Fort Snelling to St. Peter, and over the next few days, a trickle of supplies and detachments from other partially recruited infantry regiments and militia left Fort Snelling to join Sibley. And the state's military forces came under federal control on September 16th when Major General John Pope assumed command of the newly created Military Department of the Northwest. And Sibley, just appointed a brigadier general of the U.S. Army Volunteers, directed the U.S. forces in the decisive Battle of Wood Lake on September 23rd, defeating the Dakota. Many of the Dakota combatants moved westward into Dakota Territory, while others went north to Canada. But many of the men who had fought stayed with their families, who could not move swiftly enough to escape, and numerous Dakota, who had not participated in the war, as well as some of those who had, met Sibley's army at a place that came to be called Camp Release. And when he arrived, Sibley took the Dakota into custody of the U.S. military. And eventually they ended up, of course, in the concentration camp at Fort Snelling. Over the course of 3 weeks, a military commission tried 392 men for their participation in the war and sentenced 303 of them to death. Some of the trials lasted no longer than 5 minutes, and at the time and ever since, and that's because there was no rights granted to the men being tried, the Indian men. They were not citizens of the United States, therefore they did not deserve a defense like a citizen deserved. So at the time and ever since, the legal authority of the commission and the procedures it followed have been questioned. And after the trials, General Pope ordered that the convicted Dakota be removed to Mankato and the Dakota non-combatants be removed to Fort Snelling. And Sibley put Lieutenant Colonel William R. Marshall and 300 troops of the 8th and 5th Minnesota Infantry in charge of the forced removal of the Dakota from the Minnesota River Valley to Fort Snelling. The Dakota who traveled to Fort Snelling beginning November 7th of 1862 numbered 1,658, and the vast majority were women, children, and elderly. Now, at the Fort Snelling concentration camp, and I've talked about this place in this program, previous programs, and many other times, because as some of you know, many of you know, Rocky Stucci and I went down there to the site of the concentration camp. And I wouldn't call it as glorious as anything like a paranormal investigation. But we stood on that site, got the feel for the site, turned on a recorder and a voice spirit box, they call them, to see if we could raise any voices, any spirits there. And we did this in broad daylight. We didn't make a big fiasco out of it. And we did get some things. And some of you may remember the stories we've already told of that. We've been there twice now. But the concert, I'll get back to that in a second, but the Fort Snelling concentration camp, the Dakota non-combatants arrived at Fort Snelling on November 13th of 1862. And they encamped on the bluff of the Minnesota River about a mile west of the fort. Now, shortly after Marshall and his soldiers moved the Dakota to the river bottom directly below the fort, and in December, soldiers built a concentration camp, a wooden stockade more than 12 feet high, enclosing an area of 2 or 3 acres. And let me, just because we're talking about it, I'm going to throw that picture up again. There it is. There's that 12-foot tall structure going all the way around on the river flats below the fort itself. And so in December, the soldiers built this wooden stockade, and it enclosed an area of about 2 or 3 acres on the river bottom. More than 1,600 Dakota people were moved inside that stockade. A warehouse just outside the camp was used as a hospital and a mission station. And throughout the camp's existence, soldiers of the 6th, the 7th, and the 10th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry regiments guarded the stockade, controlling movement in or out of the place. And it's estimated that between 130 and 300 Dakota people died over the winter of 1862-63, mainly due to measles, other diseases, harsh conditions. The concentration camp at Fort Snelling was not technically a death camp, and the Dakota people were not systematically exterminated there. The camp was, however, a part of a genocidal policy that pursued against indigenous people throughout the U.S. The colonists and the soldiers hunted down and killed Dakota people, abused them physically and mentally, imprisoned them, and subjected them to a campaign calculated to make them stop being Dakota. So this was the plan. And that camp that you're looking at, if you're able to see the picture, that's down on the river bottom, the river flats below the bluffs. And that camp was, it was very hot and muggy and steamy and wet and bug infested. Now, we didn't have, of course, crocodiles up here or anything like that, but it was like swampland. Every time I've been there, parts of this forested area are flooded out. And there's right about where you're looking at this concentration camp here, there is probably to the far end of that stockade is about where there's a big path going through there now, and there's paths all over, and out onto Pikes Island beyond, biking paths, running paths. It's a state park now, but there is nothing showing you where this stockade stood. And however, Rocky and I, when we were going through the woods there, found lots of stone structures that were buried in the grass and in the ground, the silt, the river rising and falling. And so it would be interesting. I don't know when they conducted the last archaeological expedition there, but it would be interesting to find out what structures were standing there, what you're looking at, probably things to do with some of the small buildings, and the structure of the fort itself, or the stockade itself. So that's what happened down there on the river flats. Now there was, of course, some fallout from all of this. The removal of the Dakota and the Ho-Chunk on February 16th of 1863, just a few months after the Dakota arrived here at the camp. Congress passed an act on February 16th that abrogated and annulled all treaties with the Dakota people. You get that? It's because of this Dakota War, they annulled every single treaty that existed. And the act also stated that all lands held by the Dakota and all annuities due to them were forfeited to the U.S. government. And so a second bill, providing for the removal of the Dakota from their ancestral homelands, passed on March 3rd, not quite a month later in 1863. The aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 also engulfed the Ho-Chunk. And by the way, there's a big casino here, the Ho-Chunk Casino. Exists in the west of the Twin Cities. So the Ho-Chunk, who were living at Blue Earth at the time, the Blue Earth Reservation, which still exists today. They were living at Blue Earth, and the desire of the colonists, or the settlers, to remove all Indians from Minnesota led to a similar bill to evict the Ho-Chunk, who had been uninvolved in the war, but resided on prime agricultural land that the colonists wished to obtain. So once again, you've got an injustice of removing them from their land just because the white settlers wanted it. So in early May, the Army put the Dakota captives from the Fort Snelling camp aboard steamers, took them to a desolate reservation at Crow Creek, Dakota Territory. And the removal of the Ho-Chunk people coincided with that of the Dakota. For a brief time, the U.S. Army held hundreds of Ho-Chunk at Fort Snelling before they, too, were removed from the state. So aftermath in the execution of Sakpadan and Wakan Ozanzan, after the U.S. government forcibly removed the non-combatant Dakota from Minnesota, the war against the Dakota entered a second phase, and the concentration camp at Fort Snelling served a different purpose. In the summers of 1863 and 64, the U.S. Army launched the punitive expeditions into Dakota Territory, intent on carrying war to the Dakota people. This is the fallout of Little Crow's War. Fort Snelling became a center for marshaling supplies, stock, and troops for these efforts, and from the spring of 1863 until late summer of 1864, Dakota, who had surrendered or been captured by the Army, were held at the Fort Snelling stockade before being exiled from Minnesota. And in November of the following year, an event marked the close of the U.S.-Dakota-era war at Fort Snelling. Bedawakantuntunwan. That's a long name. And too many syllables. Bedawakantunwan. Or Medewakantan. Leaders, Sakpadan, Little Six is his name. There's a Little Six casino up here too, by the way. And Wakan Ozanzan, Medicine Bottle. So Little Six and Medicine Bottle, who had been involved in the war, though to what degree is not really certain, helped guide hundreds of Dakota people, including non-combatant women, children, and elderly, to safety in Canada after the fighting. The U.S. Army officers asked John H. Mackenzie who was there, and then they brought them all back from Canada. And the Army then imprisoned them at Fort Snelling and tried them by military commission. And in separate trials, the military charged both Little Six and Medicine Bottle with murder and general participation in the murders and massacres and other outrages committed by the Sioux Indians upon the whites in 1862. and each charge included multiple specifications related to particular acts of violence, and the commission made it clear that within the specifications that they deemed the two men as having been under the protection of the United States when the war began, and that the opposing U.S. forces and the killing of U.S. soldiers during the war were considered crimes. Both of these men, Little Six and Medicine Bottle, Sakpadan and Wakan Ozanzan, asked permission to obtain counsel. Permission was granted, but neither was able to secure an attorney. The two Bedewangtundawan, Bede Wakantunanwan leaders, there you go, pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. In both trials, witnesses gave hearsay testimony, most of them claiming that they heard one of these guys talk about possibly committing murders during the war. Multiple witnesses provided circumstantial evidence, and they were executed on November 11th of 1865. Both hung. And the Minnesota legislature awarded Mackenzie and Gregier the $1,000 as payments. And while in prison, Sakpadan supposedly heard a steam engine pass by Fort Snelling and was quoted as saying, this is a quote, "There, that is what has driven us away. That settles our fate. Over these lands my father was once undisputed chief, and over these hills I once rode free on my horse. But now, taking up the chain, look at this." Thanks for being here tonight, folks. Tomorrow night, we'll get back into this with something completely different from tonight. A different story of the subjugation of the Sioux. And we're going to look at how war came to the Cheyenne. So we'll see you then. Have a good night.